Rule number 1. If at any point the opposing player makes any comments about the Dark Angel supposedly being traitors, you can deduct 12 points from that player. Interesting. That seems very reasonable to me. Hello and welcome to the channel and 20 more common rules mistakes in Warhammer 40,000. Warhammer 40k is of course a very complicated game, and mistakes do just happen, and we should be very sympathetic when they arise. However, if you do want to become a better player, then of course it is a good idea to have as many of the rules down as possible. So let's go through 20 common rules mistakes in the game, thanks to everybody who submitted their suggestions for this video, and let's get started. Rule number 1 then. So defense line terrain changes the ranges in which you can fight in Warhammer 40k. So for example, I've got some Ultramarines here. They can still charge these Havocs behind this defense line wall, and they can still fight those Havocs as long as they're within 2 inches of the Havocs and they're touching the terrain piece. The Havocs themselves must also be within an inch of the terrain piece, which they might be doing to get cover, for example. However, where things get quite interesting though is because this is the only range that is changed. You'll notice it doesn't make any reference to engagement range, it doesn't make any reference to fighting in the second rank, and so those ranges still remain the same. So what this means, for example, is that if the intercessors cannot pile in and consolidate to within an inch of those Havocs, they can still fight them, but those Havocs are technically not in engagement range, which means that in the following turn, they can move, they can advance, they can even shoot if they'd like to. Number 2, there are times when I'll have a rule and you'll have a rule, and those rules will conflict. So for example, we have an assassin here that says you can only hit him on a ballistic skill of a 6. Well, if I have a rule that says I always hit on a 2, whose rule wins out? Well, the rulebook answers this, and it says the attacking model's rule always wins out in the game of Warhammer 40,000. Number 3, except when the attacking player's rule doesn't win out in the game of Warhammer 40,000, because interestingly we now have transhuman physiology and similar type rules, and these rules are very specific in that they have this wording. This wording is very important because it says irrespective of any abilities that the weapon or the model making the attack may have. And it's that you want to look out for. If your ability says irrespective of any abilities, then at that point, yes, your rule will win out, but otherwise the attacking model's rule always wins. Number 4, we've all seen just how powerful the bodyguard rule can be in 9th edition. It has come up a lot in the meta. However, there's another interesting application of this rule which you might not have seen. So in this example, we've got a Death Guard character who tags a repulsor. Now normally, of course, the Ultramarines player would use Big Guns Never Tire to shoot that character in combat. However, interestingly, the Death Guard character is within bodyguard range of the Death Shroud Terminators, and so the character cannot be shot. Interestingly, the bodyguard rule makes no mention at all of Big Guns Never Tire, and so you simply cannot shoot that character even if he's right next to you. Number 5, there are lots of people who still think that you can deploy part of your model over the edge of the battlefield. So for example, if I've got a big plane with big wings, I can have that wing overhang the edge of the battlefield by a little bit. This is actually not allowed in Warhammer 40k, it is specifically called out in the rulebook, but interestingly there is a provision to allow you to overhang the deployment zone. However, you can only do so in instances where you cannot fit your plane into your deployment zone. So for example, there are some missions with particularly small deployment zones and you are going to struggle to fit that in. Even with this rule though, it still remains the same that you can never deploy part of your model off the edge of the battlefield. Number 6, more Horde armies have been getting their codexes, and so the blast rule has been coming up more and more. So one thing that's good to know is that the blast rule is much better on 2 D6 shotguns than 1 2D6 shotgun when you're shooting at units with 6 to 10 models. And the reason for this is because you apply the blast rule to each gun individually. So 2 D6 guns will get minimum 3 shots each, so minimum 6. A 2 D6 gun will just get that minimum 3. And so it's actually not that good when you're shooting at units with between 6 and 10 models. Number 7, I've played with many beginner players when it comes to Warhammer 40k, and this is a very easy thing to get caught out on when you're new to the hobby. So yes, your rule does say that you can bring your model in from reserves at the end of any movement phase. That is true. And so a lot of people think that this overrides the rule that says you can only come in turn 2 and turn 3. However, this is actually not the case. So firstly, all of the rules that have a deep strike or equivalent say you can come in at the end of any movement phase. So it's not something that's specific to your unit, and actually it's the match play rules that override the codex rules in this instance. Of course, there is the drop pod now. However, I've put the wording of the drop pod on the screen so you can see how it's actually a bit different. And so actually it specifically calls out mission rules and says you don't apply them in this instance because the drop pod is special. Number 8, and another way for you to protect your characters, this time with the standard Lookout Sir rule. So as I'm sure you are aware, you can protect your characters with units that have 3 or more models, or with monsters or vehicles. However, interestingly, your character can still be shot if they're the closest visible target. Now, what is interesting about this is that, yes, most of the time, we'd have to put the Dreadnought in front of this captain. However, interestingly, if there's a second unit that is in front of the captain, we can place the Dreadnought here behind the captain, because this way all of the criteria for Lookout Sir are being applied. He is not the closest target, and he is within 3 inches of a vehicle. Number 9, and I've seen this come up as a debate for a lot of the codexes that we've had in 9th edition, because there are quite a few rules in the game now that modify the attacks characteristic. And very often people will say, well, in my wording, it doesn't say to a minimum of 1. So if I put this on a big blob of Necrons, for example, who all have got 1 attack, I can actually modify them all to have 0 attacks. Now, this is not the case, not because your rule has a mistake, but because this interaction is covered in the core rulebook, which says that you cannot modify attacks and some other characteristics to be below 1. Number 10, and I have only just realized that the graphic here looks quite a lot like an iPod for some reason. However, it does still demonstrate the point that I would like to make here, which is that objectives should be looked at as columns, not as domes as they are often looked at in the game. The reason for this is because if you are within 3 inches horizontally and 5 inches vertically of the objective, you are within range of the objective. So for example, even if you're raised 4 inches up, you can still be within range of that objective. Number 11, the most common mistake you can make in the game of Warhammer 40,000 is to not hit like and subscribe on this. I'm joking. There will be a number 11, but now I just hate myself a little bit more. So there we go. On to the real number 11. Actions are now very important in the game of Warhammer 40k, and of course a common tactic in the game is to stop your opponent from performing actions. And there are many things in the game that you can't do and perform an action at the same time. However, very interestingly, you can actually still fight. So if you are charged in your turn and you're already performing an action, and let's say it's completed in your next command phase, if you're charged and then you hit them back, the action doesn't fail. You would fail the action if you made a charge, for example, and some of the other things that are listed on the screen right now. However, fighting is perfectly fine and you can still complete the action in the next command phase. Number 12, but before I get to that, my favourite rule in Warhammer 40,000 is that if you have a Psyker by a Commissar and you Perils of the Warp, the Commissar will very kindly shoot the Psyker in the head to prevent them from blowing up. It's very 40k, I love that. However, if you are unfortunate enough, you can of course Perils of the Warp blow up and deal mortal wounds to units nearby. Now what is interesting about this though, is that even though you are overcome with psychic power if you roll a double 6, the psychic power still fails. It cannot go off. If you die first, and so the psychic power is null and void. Number 13, and because of the way that light cover is applied in Warhammer 40k, you can actually put just some of your models into light cover and some of them out of cover. Maybe you need to string out to get onto an objective, for example, and you can start taking saves on the models that are in cover first, and then once they've all died, you can take your normal armor save. You don't have to put all of the models into light cover in order to get that benefit. Number 14, and Imperial Fist Infiltrators. I'm primarily looking at you, but it does come up in a few places. So there are some times in the game where you might have two rules that both apply to the same unit. So the Infiltrator has a rule that says on a hit roll of a 6 you automatically wound, and the Imperial Fist rule means that on a 6 to hit with a bolt weapon you get 2 hits. Now sometimes people argue that if that happens you get 2 automatic wounds. So this is actually not how it is played. So think about it like you're splitting the attacks. So the first attack, yes, does hit on a 6 and automatically wounds. That generates another hit, but that hit is not automatically a 6. So for that attack you will still have to roll to wound. Number 15, Deathwatch players, Custodes players, their favourite thing used to be taking wounds on units as they liked. They had no care for which models you wanted to kill. However, very interestingly, Games Workshop changed this rule in 9th edition, and so now as soon as you start taking saves on a model in the unit, you have to keep taking saves on that model for the rest of the phase until that model dies. Likewise, if at the start of the phase you've got any models that have already lost wounds, you have to put the wounds on that model first. You can't just jump about anymore and take wounds on models as you'd like. Number 16. So, if you come on from strategic reserves and you come on from your battlefield edge, you can actually place a model within an inch of the battlefield edge and get into engagement range. And that means you don't have to make a charge. And so what this means in an actual game is that if my opponent has these Reavers, for example, and they've thrown them up the board, threatened my deployment zone straight away, well, if it's my turn too, I can actually bring a unit on from reserves and get into combat with that unit. I don't have to make a 9-inch charge, I can just go and fight them and punish whatever it is that has dared threaten your backline. Number 17, and there's really 2 parts to this. So number 1, when it comes to command rerolls, there are specific things now that you can reroll in Warhammer 40k. You can't reroll anything. You can't reroll explosions, you can't reroll smite damage. I know it inflicts damage, but it is not a specific damage roll. That is something that happens when you are in combat or when you are shooting, for example. The other thing that's important about the command reroll is that you have to reroll the entire roll. So shots are made one at a time. So if you want to reroll a single hit, that would be just one shot. However, if you've got a charge roll and you want to reroll that, a charge roll is one roll, so you have to reroll both of the dice. Number 18, and I'm sure you are often very tempted to take Assassinate when you are playing against Celestine, for example, because she has got 3 models in her unit and they all count as characters, and so she is worth 9 points, or 10 if she's the Warlord. However, this has led to an interesting example, because she can resurrect one of her Gemini. And if she does that, sometimes people get confused as to whether if you kill that Gemini again, does that count as a second kill for the purposes of Assassinate? And the answer is no, because Assassinate is scored at the end of the game, and so you simply count up the number of characters that are killed at the end of the game and you get points for those models. Of course, typically you'll score this as you go throughout Warhammer 40k, but it's one of those things where technically speaking you would score it at the end of the game instead. Number 19, and probably the most contentious of all of the rules I have discussed in this video, which is that if you are disembarking from a transport, let's say your Rhino here has exploded, you have to disembark the tactical squad inside, there's 10 tactical marines, and that Rhino is surrounded by poxwalkers to the point that you can only fit 4 of the tactical marines. There's a bit of contention because some people believe that the way it should be played is that if you can't fit the squad is destroyed. However, if you look in the rulebook, it actually does address this. So we have these two wordings that I've put on the screen. So wording number 1 says that if the vehicle is destroyed, you disembark, and if you disembark, you have to place the whole unit wholly within 3 inches of the transport. And notably, this wording doesn't mention what happens if you can't fit the whole unit. However, if you flip back in the rulebook and you have a look at the unit coherency rules, it specifically says that if you have to set up a unit, and setting up a unit from a transport is still setting up a unit, and you cannot fit all of the models, then the models that can't be set up are destroyed. And so in this example, I can only fit up 4 tactical marines. I would set up those 4 tactical marines, the other 6 are destroyed, and then I would roll dice to see if the tactical marines that were set up are also destroyed. I've tried to explain a bit more deeply the reasoning behind how this should be played. However, in a game, it's quite straightforward. You set up as much of the unit as you can, anything you can't set up is destroyed, and then you roll dice to see if any more models are slain. Number 20, and something that I think is a little bit counterintuitive if you're somebody who's new to the game of Warhammer 40k, which is that you can actually punch someone through a wall in Warhammer. So there is nothing in the rules that says you need line of sight when you're making a melee attack, and so if somebody is right up against the wall, you can still punch them through it. Cinematically, maybe you can imagine something quite impressive there. However, it's obviously a bit confusing to a lot of new players, and what it typically leads to in competitive games of Warhammer 40k is this situation where when you are setting up in a ruin, for example, you'll very often say, I'm just over an inch back from the wall, and this is a way of playing the game in such a way to make it very clear that you're inside of the ruin, but your opponent would have to go around to get into combat with you, or get into the ruin another way. Thanks very much for watching this video. Thanks again to everybody who actually suggested rules and things that they often see played wrong in the game. Again, I hope this video was really useful to you. But again, do remember that this is a complicated game and mistakes do just happen. The reason I know all of these rules is basically because I've probably made most of these mistakes at a certain point. It does just happen. Please do remember rule number 11 and hit that